It's funny, when I was thinking the video up in my head, the boxer I had in mind when I started researching my notes was promoted by Frank Warren in the 80s. His name was George Collins. He retired with a record of 35 wins, 24 inside the distance, 2 defeats, and 1 of them defeats by stoppage. He was a standout amateur. He had 77 bouts, I believe. He was on the cusp of getting into the World Guinness Book of Records. I think maybe for most tournaments won, or maybe amateur bouts won consecutively. I'm not too sure. He was on the cusp of doing something big anyway. And he was knocked out by Gary Stretch, who went on to challenge Chris Eubank for the middleweight title as a pro. And that was his only defeat as an amateur. Frank Warren signed him up as an 18-year-old. There was a lot of hype behind George. His brother Tony later turned pro too. Now, we're basically going to reflect on today's boxing to yesteryear. So George, as far as I know, he didn't fight in the ABAs. He didn't fight in the ABAs because he didn't stay senior long enough. I'm not sure if he turned senior as an amateur. So he went straight to the pros. Yeah? Now, Anthony Yarde's amateur experience is always brought up by Frank Warren and Tunde, his coach. Why they're not rushing him? He had 12 amateur bouts. And George Collins, on the other hand, had an extensive amateur career with 77 bouts. That's quite a bit. That's quite a bit. Although, we know of a lot of amateurs who've had way more fights than that. But 77 and losing only 1 out of them 77 is no mean achievement. Saturday just gone, Yarde fought in the Brentwood Centre in Essex with a maximum seating capacity of 2,000. And all I saw post-fight videos for Yarde was people critiquing the empty spaces in the arena. 2,000 capacity filled with empty spaces. Now, a lot of the criticism was aimed at Frank Warren because a lot of people are just not dealing with this Anthony Yarde opponent situation right now. They're just not dealing with it in a way that I think Frank Warren or Tunde can really be comfortable about. They're sticking to their guns resolutely. They shall not be moved. But surely Frank Warren's got to be looking at this Anthony Yarde situation, because I was just listening to an O'Hara Davis video and there was some telling information that came out of it. Like I said, there was complaints about, not complaints, but there was observations of a lot of empty seating, and he headlined the card. But there was another fight on the bill, a really good fight. Johnny Garton won the British welterweight title, and he had a whole load of Millwall fans in there. And somebody posted up a video on that card of fighting in the crowd. Now, I'm not going to say it was Garton fans, but I started to put a few mental pictures together in my brain of who was involved in that fight. And O'Hara said when they called Garton's name, the place roared. So basically, a southern area fighter stepping up to British level brought more crowd than the headliner, Anthony Yarde. And in all truth, Garton versus Corcoran, who fought Jeff Horn for the IBF title, was a way more competitive match than what Yarde had. So you're headlining cards, and the undercard fight is bringing all the support, what little support was in Brentwood there. That's crazy. And it's all down to his matchmaking. Not that he's not a popular guy. He's obviously popular amongst the boxing fraternity, but people ain't stupid. They're not going to put their hands in their pockets because you're undefeated and you do a lot of YouTube videos. It doesn't take a lot of research to find out who the opponents are. And they're not going to start paying until they see an upgrade in opposition. And it's okay Tunde talking about computerized BoxRec rankings. People don't care about that. Yeah? People don't care about that. People like rivalry. Like 2 guys from 2 different parts of a city in one country perhaps. America versus USA. Before it used to be Puerto Rico, Mexico. That's what they like. They like that. They're not into no computerized BoxRec rankings. which to me are not very accurate. If we're going off that, Tunde said, well, all the opponents that the rest of the British fighters are fighting are not as good as the ones that Yarde are fighting. And then we saw what Boxer'S done to Avalon a couple of weeks back, who took Yarde 7 rounds. He took him apart in a round. So what does that say about the computerized rankings and the standard of opposition that Yarde's facing? What does that say now to that argument? But look, George Collins, his career was over within 4 years, from 85 to 89. It was over. Now, the prospects fought way more back in the 80s. So he's packing in a lot of fights in a year. A lot of these fights were on ITV, or Midweek Sports Special. That was the program back in the day. Frank Warren had 2 guys. He had 2 guys who he relied heavily on to build his stable from when he first came into boxing. Ernie Fossey, he was a former booth fighter. He used to fight in the Fairground booths, became a pro, became a trainer, and he helped in the matchmaking. Dean Powell, he probably learnt the ropes alongside Ernie in the 80s, and Frank depended on Dean heavily for the matchmaking, training duties, and, you know, them guys did it all. They did it all. They did it all. So Ernie probably oversaw a lot of the matchmaking in George's career. And I know I'd still probably have the same disagreements with a lot of people when I told them, you can't do anything in boxing without good matchmaking. There's nothing you can do. You can't do anything. But what about my natural guys and the natural abilities? There's riots and film script talk. That's film. What you're talking at is film script talk. Save that for a film script. Domestic boxing was still big in Britain. Yeah? They were showing it on ITV. They were showing it on BBC. There was an audience there for it. People turned up to the arenas all around the country. And that's even with the fact that the numbers of boxers going into the ring by the 80s were declining. Ernie Fossey himself said that the standard of boxing had declined in the country and that matchmaking had become more difficult by a shortage of fighters. Now, between me and Frank Warren, let's not sugarcoat this, Frank. You served up George Collins a lot of Mexican road sweepers, as Nigel Benn called them, and a lot of empty cans of British ale, let's just say. Guys like Ian Chartler, who Nigel Benn knocked out in seconds, were served up. And his record was padded. Collins' record was padded. 37 fights in 4 years. And his record was padded. They stepped him up in fight 36 against Gary Jacobs, who I'd probably say Gary Jacobs was world class. A Scottish welterweight. Let's say fringe world class. Let's go for fringe world class. He went the distance with James Buddy McGirt in New York and gave a decent account for himself, but, you know, McGirt was a really good fighter. He's a trainer these days. He fought Pernell Whitaker for the WBC title later and lost to UD. Highest point of his career was the Ludovic Proto victory, the French fighter who previously outpointed Jacobs for the Euro title in France. But in a rematch, Jacobs stopped Protovic, who was good, a black French fighter, good fighter. And a lot was expected from Protovic. And Jacobs stopped him. Jacobs had some unexpected losses like against Mickey Hughes. But Hughes could bang. He could bang pretty hard at domestic level. And he caught Jacobs. Jacobs was well ahead. Jacobs was a crafty southpaw. And he built up a wide points lead. Huge deficit for Hughes. And Hughes cancelled it out with one shot in the 8th round. Knocked him out cold. He took Collins' unbeaten record. It was a very, very tough fight, though. There was only a point in it. And I think a late knockdown sealed George Collins' fate from what I can remember. I don't know if the fight is online or anything. A late knockdown sealed his fate. Good fight, though. Excellent fight. And Collins put up a good battle. This was for the Commonwealth title and the World Boxing Council International Welterweight title at the Royal Albert Hall in '89, 4 years after turning pro. They stepped him up. Jacobs was the champion, so the fight was on BBC. Like, Frank Warren promoted George Collins on ITV. I remember it being on BBC. I'm sure it was. Well, at this stage here, there's no turning back. You can't put George back in with the opposition he's been previously facing. Yeah, it's just too far to step back. That's just like hustling backwards totally. So he takes a little rest, and they match him up with Kirkland Lang, who beat Roberto Duran on points. Bit of a British enigma in many ways. He was just coming off a unanimous decision loss against Nino La Rocca, an Italian. A good fighter. This is for the vacant European title in Italy. Black Italian. He looks black to me anyway. And La Rocca was a good fighter. He fought Don Cry for the title, didn't do very well. But you're talking about a 72-4 fighter in Nino La Rocca. But I guess they thought the Nino La Rocca fight signaled a fighter in decline. Now let me just say this. If you fought Kirkland on an inspired day, you're going to have trouble. You're going to have great trouble. And George Collins caught Kirkland on that day there. Kirkland, that night there, he shone. Absolutely shone. Destroyed George Collins and ended his career right there. Now, why is Anthony Yarde getting such criticism after only 17 fights and 12 amateur bouts? And George Collins avoided a lot of the stick that Yarde is taking currently. Well, Collins did get stick. If you picked up a boxing news, like I did, they would question the level of the opposition, but not heavily. Not heavily. It wouldn't make front page. And why would it? There's bigger stuff to cover back then. There's Marvin Hagler, there's Tommy Hearns. Mike Tyson's coming up or whatever. There's bigger stuff. You know, Don Curry. Lloyd Hunnigan was the top welterweight in the country at this stage here. He hadn't won the title yet, but he was the top guy. There was Mark Kaler, Simpson at middleweight. There was Frank Bruno, Harold Graham, another middleweight. But here's the thing. Like I said, he's fighting in front of bigger numbers than Anthony Yarde is. Because we're talking 1985. There is no Channel 5. There's just 4 channels. Just 4. Just 4. BBC One, BBC Two, ITV, and Channel 4. That's all there is. So boxing used to do huge numbers. Huge numbers. Alongside football. Boxing was up there with football, rugby, cricket, and all the other mainstream sports back then. Snooker, huge, huge. It's not a terrestrial TV sport no more. Yeah, Channel 5 are going to show Huey Fury versus Pulev, and ITV are going to broadcast Eubank versus DeGale, and they're going to try and make it pay-per-view. No doubt about that, but you can't compare them nights to Ben Eubank, Watson, or McGuigan, Frank Bruno, Nassim Hamid when he was on there. You just can't compare that. You can't compare that. You can't compare that. Henry Cooper. Big up Barry McGuigan because he's obviously got that Cyclone thing going on. Channel 5 gave him a contract. And he said for boxing to be big, it needs to be on terrestrial television for free. You know, that's how you can really develop stars. And big up him for his input because that's how he became big. Imagine that. 19 million watched him live to fight Eusebio Pedrosa in 1985 at Loftus Road. Yeah, I remember it. I remember that day. 19 million. It's never going to happen. That's never going to happen again in British boxing. And if ITV are serious, they need to give one away for free. And Eubank the Girl would be a great one. Would be an excellent one. Eubank the Girl would be excellent. And, you know, I don't understand Channel 5, man. Like, when they brought it back for the UK, the first fight between Tyson Fury and Derek Chisora was excellent. Excellent. And then they took ages to get back on TV with another fight, and they just didn't get the matchmaking right. And, like, they opened the door, but they were too scared to follow up and walk inside and take it over. All the success Eddie Hearn is having now is on a subscription-based channel. That makes it even more remarkable whatever Joshua is doing or whatever Carl Froch did at Matchroom. So George Collins was fighting all these substandard opponents for the best part of 4 years. Yeah? And not everything was on TV, but a whole load of it was on television. A whole load. Well, the difference is, I know everything about, not everything about Anthony. I know he's from Hackney. Yeah? I know the Peacock Gym. I know Tunde's history. I know he worked with Spencer Fearon. He was in the corner with Don Charles when Derek Chisora fought Vitali. He used to train Junior Saba. With his dad, Mr. Ajayi, very respected boxing coach in the London boxing community. I know the big guy who Yarde does the pads and spars with. I don't know his name. I know their mantra, Lions in the Camp. There's stories about Anthony Yarde every week, just like most boxers on a popular promotion. There's stories about either him, if he's not doing an interview, Ajayi's doing one, or Frank Warren's talking about him. His profile is considerably wider than George Collins. Now, let's bear this in mind. Yarde had his 17th fight on Saturday, and in 2019, he'll be approaching his 4th year as a pro. By Collins' 4th year as a pro, his career was finished, and he had 37 fights. That's way over double the number of what Yarde has had. Yeah. Now, people will try and make a debate that Yarde only had limited amateur experience, but he's 28 years of age. Collins was pitched in as a pro at 18 years of age. And Frank kept him way busier than he's keeping Anthony. And you're saying Anthony has limited amateur experience, but you can only try and make up for his lack of amateur experience by giving him the competition they're giving him for so long because of his advanced age. He's not a kid, he's 28 years of age. Because realistically, the only way you could compensate for his lack of amateur experience is to make him fight double the amount he's fighting. Kind of like what they did with Mike Tyson when he came up. He was fighting every week. If Yarde's going to fight this level of opposition, get it over with quick. Accelerate the pace. Accelerate, because you don't want to go on 4 years fighting this level of opposition at the pace that he's doing it. Accelerate it quick. Fight 6 Seguiras next year. 6 of them, not 3. 6. You need to get this level. Yarde needs to get this level out of his system ASAP. I predict 1 more year of fighting this level of opposition, as infrequently as he's doing it, is just going to produce bad habits. That's all it's going to do. It's not going to benefit him. It's not going to compensate for the lack of amateur experience. No way. Collins was pitched in at 18. You see, Collins may have done big audiences, but after his fight, we wouldn't hear from him until he was scheduled to be back in the ring. In January 1988, he fights, and in February 1988, he fights. Now, in between them 2 fights, I won't hear about George Collins unless he does something crazy, yeah, that gets him on the front page of a tabloid paper, like he goes on a shooting spree or something. Won't hear from him. With Anthony Yarde, he fought on Saturday, and there's post-fight videos everywhere. We make them on YouTube, on all the boxing sites, the sporting sites. His name is everywhere. George Collins didn't have that. He didn't have that. The most he's going to get post-fight is an article in one of the red tops the next day. That's the most. And it would be very basic footnotes. Yeah, George Collins fought in the Alexander Pavilion, won by stoppage, 8th round, the name, the opponent, the date. And that's that. That would be it. And, you know, maybe if it was a decent scrap, there might be a little more in it. Just a few more details. And then obviously you get the weekly boxing news, which only a select few of us buy who are into boxing, yeah? And then you'll get a detailed fight report. I bet you any money you won't find more than 2 George Collins interviews in a boxing magazine from the 80s. Maybe a couple. Maybe a couple. I remember one when he retired. I remember one. And that would be that. Put Anthony Yarde in your search engine now, just for information and videos on him today and his fight on Saturday. Because that's just how it is for sportsmen, women, and entertainers these days, with the online phenomenon, the internet phenomenon. IFL, Boxing Social, Seconds Out, me, you. Everyone's covering his fight. He fought some nondescript Argentinian whose name you can't pronounce now. And look how much press coverage that fight is getting. It didn't fill out the 2,000 capacity. So his hype, and I'm not saying he's a hype job, I'm saying everyone has hype, but I'm saying his hype is actually outdoing his market value right now. This is a man who turned down a world title fight recently. See, back then, there were some hungry British fighters. Turned down a title fight? What? They thought they'd never get mentioned along the champions, let alone turn it down. The only guy, British fighter, I can remember a story of turning down title fights was Henry Cooper. His manager, Jim Wick, said, I wouldn't let Henry on the same road as Sonny Liston. They weren't having it. And when Joe Frazier was champion, they weren't having it. They felt more comfortable with Muhammad Ali because he didn't hit as hard as them guys. You know, so they fought Ali before he won the title, and they fought Ali when he won the title for the title. Tunde is probably doing the right thing in protecting Yarde because he is very inexperienced. But this is social media. This is a different era. The fans are demanding domestic showdowns. You turn down a world title shot, you're turning down domestic showdowns, and it's because of all the exposure, press coverage you're getting. You've got to live up to your billing to a degree. Now, no one can fully live up to any overinflated billing. But, you know, you've got a mantra, lions in the camp. That says a lot. That says a lot. These things were previously reserved for world champions who were going to go in and do battle, or if not world, at least European champions. You know, to be a lion, you can't be a lion, and this is just a metaphor for boxing I'm using, and not be fighting other lions. If you're still learning your trade, then you need to tone it down a little because you get called out. Of course you're going to get called out. I think coaches and promoters have to sit up and take notice of the changing of the times. If you over-promote your prospect before he's ready to step into the deep waters, or she, then yeah, you may be forced to, you know, feel obligated to take on the challenge before you're ready, perhaps. Because no boxer wants to have the reputation of allegedly being cowardly. You don't. Fighters do need developing. Let's take Isaac Chamberlain versus Lawrence Okoli. That fight wouldn't have happened pre-social media. The Twitter interaction between the two fighters and the egos being displayed all over social media forced them into that fight. If that fight was going to happen years ago, they would have probably at least had 10, 14 fights apiece, and they would have fought for the Southern Area Cruiserweight title, if I'm talking about the 90s and the 80s, or even the earlier part of this millennium. And it wouldn't necessarily have to be unbeaten. They just have to have proved that they're the top prospects at that time. I read about Mike Tyson in the Ring magazine, Boxing News, KO magazine, before I saw him fight. I read about him. And he was getting red hot at the time. Oh man, I need to see Mike Tyson fight. Seen all these fights. And the first time I saw him was against Mitch Green. That's the first time they aired him, ITV, Saturday afternoon. That was his 22nd fight. And they showed some of the highlight reels as well. 22nd fight. People ask, how do you know so much about boxing? You see, well, that's what it is. Do you know how much fighters I had to wait? I read about before I saw. So I'm storing the information about these guys, who they're fighting, and I haven't seen them fight yet. I had to wait to see a lot of fights, to see a lot of fighters. So I store information about fights, dates, opponents, and stuff like that. That's why. That's why. And until YouTube, some of the fights that I read about from the 80s, I didn't see until YouTube came along. How much top prospects have you had to wait to see since social media, since the internet? No, you just go, click a couple of buttons, there they are there, you know. The last few fights I can think was that Carlton Dokwa. There wasn't much film in him. There was one fight. And the guy Tyson Fury fought, Sefra Sefri. There was one fight where Manuel Charr was beating him up around the ring. Apart from them two guys who are relatively, I don't want to say nondescript with Carlton Dokwa. He can fight a little. But they're low-key guys. Yeah? But top prospects, no. You go to the internet and you'll find the footage. Amateur fights, pro fights, interviews, information. You find out who the coach is, where they train, and everything. You get a full picture of a top prospect nowadays. No mistake. You see, back then, if boxing fans were frustrated, even if they were frustrated with fighters' slow progress, where was the outlet? Yeah, you can scream amongst you and your friends who watch boxing, who like boxing. But it goes no further than that. Nowadays, we have forums, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. We've got so many platforms where we can chop it up, voice our disapproval. Back then, you hash it out with your friends, and then that's it. The rest of the world don't get to hear your conversation, or thousands of people, or hundreds. No one gets to hear it. The fighter you're critiquing doesn't get to hear it, and that's it. Back in the day, when it was just boxing magazines as the main source of information, like the boxing news used to have a letters page, and people used to write letters in about what they didn't like or what they did like. And to me, that was always a very interesting section of the magazine in the boxing news, the letters page, to hear what people had to say. Like a low budget boxing promotion. How do they survive all them years without social media? Word of mouth, pub, fly posters, boxing gyms, perhaps advertising the boxing news, local newspapers, and if they had bigger budgets, maybe put an ad in a tabloid. Maybe. But these days, it's just all about social media. A couple of clicks, you can find fight schedules of where this event is happening and where that fighter is fighting. But the world used to function without social media, and function well. What you have to realize is, when you're talking British boxing, in the 50s and the 60s, when Jack Solomons and Harry Levine, they were the big promoters. Solomons was doing 80,000, 90,000 gates at the White City. Haringey Arena was always full and packed out. Amateur boxing used to be huge on television. Huge. They used to do so well that professional boxing on television was the scourge and the enemy of boxing promoters. Because you're going to put this fight or the card on television for free. Well, why is the average person going to get out in the cold weather, march down to this small hall arena to watch the fight and have to pay for it and then travel and all the other things that you have to do if you're not watching it on television? And it was Harry Levine who said that. The boxing booths was basically a concept where, there used to be a lot of fairgrounds in the United Kingdom. People didn't sit on their asses with their heads in their phones or around a computer all day or playing PlayStation or whatever all day. So people used to go fairgrounds, and they used to have boxing booths in the fairgrounds until around the 70s actually. And you're talking Tommy Farr, Benny Lynch, Freddie Mills, Len Johnson. That was a common way to get into the game, to get into boxing, as well as the amateur circuit, because, people had to earn money back then. So a lot of these kids who fancied themselves as boxers or who were good boxers, they would travel around with the booth, fair to fair, and they'd get free lodging, food, a few pounds in their pocket, and someone would go around collecting some money, and they call it nobbins, and they'd share it amongst the fighters or whatnot. They used to have nobbins in professional boxing in Britain as well, and that actually didn't stop until the 80s. I used to read the boxing news, and there was fights where nobbins were thrown in the ring. Yeah, up until the 80s. And the booth fighter, or the house fighter, you could say, would be challenged by members of the public. People just turning up to the fairground. Some people would try and impress their girlfriend or their wife, or actually fancy themselves as good fighters. And if you challenged and managed to go to 3 rounds with the fighter from the booth, you get a monetary prize. Often what they would do, they would place a plant inside the crowd who would challenge the booth fighter, and Obviously it would be a setup because he'd do pretty well. And some gullible twat would say, oh yeah, we'll go out there and smack up the booth fighter, and then, you know, you might be quite a big guy, for instance, and you think, oh, I can knock out this guy here. It's just a little small, skinny guy. Next thing, you're in the ring with Jimmy Wilder before he became a world champion, and he's smacking the fuck out of you. This little guy just beating the crap out of you. The booths came to an end in the 70s because a lot of pros used to still use the booths. But the British Boxing Board of Control brought a ruling in that you would lose your license if you were found to be plying your trade at a booth. And in America, guys like Henry Armstrong and Jack Dempsey, they fought what they would call smokers, illegal fights. I don't know the details or how that worked. But yeah, they had hundreds of smoker fights. Tim Witherspoon, he had 8 fights. He had 8 fights as an amateur. And one of them was against Marvis Frazier, who was a top amateur. And he lost that. And Witherspoon, with 8 fights behind him, turned pro. And he challenged Larry Holmes way before he had 20 fights. He had about maybe 15 fights. And lost could have went the other way, decision to Holmes. Yeah. And went on to become a 2-time heavyweight champion with good scalps. Bone Crusher Smith, Greg Page, Tony Tubbs, knocked out James Tillis in a round, Frank Bruno. Now, it didn't work for George Collins, but thinking about it, if you're going to fight, for a better term, bums, to develop your prospect, I think you need to feed him a whole lot in a short space. Mike Tyson fought, you know, his fair amount. Turned pro March 1985, and 22nd of November 1986, he knocked out Trevor Burbick to win WBC title. Yeah? Now, you do the maths on that. Was that 19 months or something like that? 20 months? He won the title in 20 months from turning pro. But he crammed in 28 fights. 28 fights. 17 fights in 4 years for Anthony Yarde. Now, here's some of the problems with that. A bum is a bum. And they often say, if you're going to feed a fighter a bum, you treat him like a bum and you knock him out as quickly as possible. That's what you do with bums. But in 17 fights in approaching your 4th year as a pro, you're practically preparing for bums like they're world title fights. Mike Tyson was fighting them week after week, literally. And there's nothing wrong with that. You should always prepare meticulously. But over 4 years, you could argue that the same resume he has now, he could have done it in 2 or 3 years, rather than approaching his 4th year. 2019 will be his 4th year. You could argue that. And Low Place was pointing out, you know, you're going in to fight this Argentinian who looks like a middleweight, and you're finish shelling him like, man, you know. And that's cool if that's your style. But no problem with the finish shell. But that should mean you're approaching the end of your apprenticeship if you're finish shelling that. If you can do such accomplished moves, surely the opponent choice should be a little more ambitious. It's kind of like if I had the same amount of fights as Yarde and relatively the same level of competition, and I'm trying to do that Roy Jones move, putting my hands behind my back and trying to knock someone out. What would that tell anyone with any common sense who follows boxing? This guy is ready for a step up in opposition. That's why you take the fights, yeah? To develop your craft to a certain level. Ali won the title in 1964 against Sonny Liston. And when he finished, he done the Ali shuffle. When Liston was sitting down in the corner, you see Ali doing the shuffle. But he didn't do it during the fight. He didn't do it during the fight. No. That came later in his 7th title defense. That was the first time he done the Ali shuffle mid-fight against Cleveland Williams. So he knew he could do it, but he wasn't going to risk it against Liston. He wasn't going to risk it against Patterson or Chuvalo. No. He was a world champion, but he was still getting his confidence up. And if you remember, I was talking about Joshua needed a big performance. I had a video. I think that was roughly the title. Joshua needed a massive performance against Povetkin. And I kept saying Cleveland Williams. Cleveland Williams. And what I meant by that, I'll reveal now, is that is said to be Ali's gold standard performance. The perfect display of boxing. And Joshua didn't quite get there, but he done very well against Povetkin. He done very well, you know? So let me just reiterate and let me just repeat for the last time. Philly Shelling, especially for a British fighter, is telling me you're advanced. It's kind of like David Haye. David Haye used to emulate Roy Jones' style quite a bit. He'd drop his hands and he'd lunge in with power shots from that wide-legged stance. Wouldn't even bother with the jab. Now, David Haye, Carl Froch are probably the last Brits who built their reps fighting on BBC after Orley Harrison's tenure ended with them doing a HBO and not broadcasting boxing, basically, as far back as 2004 or 2005, and they've never shown it since then. 13 years on. Shut it down. And they both went on to become some of the best modern-day UK fighters. Can't deny that. Can't deny that. Carl Froch was quite flashy, drop his hands. I think he studied a lot of Nassim Hamid. I remember him saying that. But David Haye wasn't posing around with his hands down to stay at domestic level. No. He challenged former world champion Carl Thompson, who was still dangerous at the time, in his 11th fight. And it went wrong. Yeah, it did go wrong. It did go wrong. He was beating Thompson until, he flagged. But Thompson's a big puncher. A lot of people say, Haye would have beat Thompson if he wasn't inexperienced. Hold your horses there. Hold your horses. Thompson was never no slouch. Thompson could take a remarkable amount of punishment and still come back with sledgehammer-type punches, jaw-breaking shots. He was ambitious, Haye. Took on Gary Delaney when he was a cruiserweight. Delaney outweighed him by about 30 pounds. That was after the Thompson fight. Shortly after that, European titles. Defended that several times. And he was fighting Jean-Marc Mormec in France by his 20th fight. He only had 32 fights. From 2002 to 2018, 32 fights. But within 32 fights, he managed to be unified cruiserweight champion, WBA heavyweight champion. He's got some good scalps. Derek Chisora, a really good scalp. Beat Nikolai Valuev, Enzo Macronelli, Jean-Marc Mormec. And I'm 100% sure if he didn't lose to Carl Thompson, they would have fast-tracked him to that world title way, way quicker. Because him and Adam Booth seemed like they was in a rush. It was actually the British Telecom broadcasting team who pointed out when Yarde's lack of amateur experience came up. Well, he said, he's a full-time pro now. So forget all that lack of amateur pedigree. He's a full-time pro. This is what he does. Peter Manfredo, Joe Smith Jr., construction worker. Eric Molina, works with disabled children. Of all multitask regular jobs whilst training for world titles. And there's more than that. Anthony Yarde basically is with the second best promotional outfit in the United Kingdom. And all he has to do is train and fight. So all this lack of amateur experience, all he has to do is train and fight, and that's that. In fact, if you're a British amateur boxer, unless you are qualified for that lottery funding, you too will have to train, fight, and work, unless you can find a really good sponsor. Team Yarde can afford to get top-of-the-range nutritionist, strength, conditioning, technical coaching. They can afford to bring in a very good standard or sparring partner if they want to fast track and take the step-up fights quicker. There's no excuse, really. So it's within his choice to eat, sleep, drink boxing. He doesn't have to worry about going and traveling anywhere else to work and then rushing back to the gym and multitasking, just boxing. There's been lots of fighters who've had padded records, and it's an inevitable part of the process, the way professional boxing is constructed, no doubt about that. But you can't really get a full analysis on what appears to be mollycoddling or cherry-picking for a contender or a prospect until their career's over. Like Rocky Marciano, there's always these critiques that, he fought old men and he didn't fight no one until he was in his 40th plus fight or whatever. There was always them critiques. But then again, they always talk about the record, the heavyweight record he set of 49-0, you know? And his wins, Joe Louis, Walcott twice, Ezra Charles twice, they kind of sealed his legacy. Them 5 fights there, they sealed his legacy. Is that enough? Do we have to inquire about some of the opponents he fought before? No, I wouldn't say so. There's some good names in there. There's Archie Moore. There's Roland Lastaza, who he fought twice. Arguably, Lastaza won the first fight, but I don't think Lastaza was an elite fighter of the day. He certainly wasn't. They talk about guys like Rex Lane. He wasn't a bad fighter, but I can't verify how great he was. Then there was always speculation that he ducked Nino Valdez, who used to spar Luis Ortiz. No, Valdez was a Cuban heavyweight, and they say Rocky ducked him. You know what I mean? Didn't give him a title shot. But there was different criteria then. A lot of the boxing fans, they didn't rate Rocky because he never lost. Because he didn't lose, and they said, we don't know how great he is until you lose and go through the adversity of losing and come back. We don't know how great you are. So it was a different criteria. You was expected to lose. It wasn't the Mayweather phenomenon where this undefeated thing is really important to the point fighters are fighting once a year and twice a year now. Die-hard Rocky Marciano fans will not be too pleased if you say Rocky was mob-controlled, but Rocky was mob-affiliated. He was known to fraternize and take gifts of members of the mob. Did they play a part in his matchmaking? Can't prove it. Can't prove it. When you're talking 40s, 50s, a lot of grey area right there. Rocky actually had less amateur fights than Yarde. He had about 13 amateur fights. And he lost 4 of them 13 fights. So that's not a great start. He also had one of the shortest reaches of any of the heavyweight champions, a 68-inch reach. And he was very crude, extremely crude. So they had to match him wisely. And he needed a lot of training. His trainer was Charlie Goldman, a gentleman of Jewish persuasion, who, according to Mike Tyson, had hundreds of amateur bouts. And he knew his business. And he coached Rocky. He coached Rocky. And as crude as you see Rocky on film, that's nothing to what he was producing in the earlier fights. I would have liked to see some of the earlier fights, you know. But here's the thing. Here's the thing. You can say Rocky, his record is padded, but he turned pro in 1947. And by the time he fought Roland Lastaza, it was 3 years. 3 years in. Yeah? The opponents before Lastaza can't really vouch too much for them, how good some of them were. Some of them had winning records, and some certainly didn't. But here's the thing. Most of them fights are not on television. Yeah? They're not on television. He had a very short career. But he did achieve a lot. And he was very humble. Now, I'm not saying that makes you a better fighter. Let's not read into that. Don't read that into what I'm saying. But if you're humble and you don't have mantras like certain other fighters, and you're not barking out how good you are, then as much as people can critique your technique and opposition, you're not saying that you're there. You're not saying that. Once you say that, there's an expectation for you to prove that. If you want to live in the camera and you're not a model, then people want to see the talent. They want to see the talent manifest itself. So yeah, Rocky was crude. I can imagine he looked really awful in some of them early fights. And some of the fights he was fighting were terrible. But it wasn't on television. You don't really get no footage of Rocky until he's beating the likes of Rex Lane, who was ranked. He was ranked. Yeah? Harry Matthews, who had a good record. Then you see the Walcotts, the Lewis's, the Ezra Charles fights, the Archie Moore, the Don Cockle fights, the world title fights. That's what you see. That's what you see for the most part. But it's kind of like being a rap artist or any kind of musical artist these days. There's few labels who are going to just sign you for your music. It's that 360-degree thing. Because there's so much streams that artists can make revenue from. The contracts are constructed differently from how they once was. And I'm saying that, oh, well, Yarde should tone it down and Well, if he toned it down, there would be no Adidas deal there. He's got an Adidas deal, which I'm assuming is very lucrative. I'm not going to tell you. Don't make no noise until you're ready to fight someone. No, they're going to do what they're doing. I could talk about old school and all that, but the facts are Lions in the camp, and his swag, his mannerism, his personality got him that deal. All the knockouts he scored, his backstory, coming from the hoods of Hackney. You can critique the opposition, but this is what it is. People are bought into the Anthony Yarde brand, and we don't even know if he can win domestic titles at this stage yet. What that tells us with the Adidas deal is all the advertising revenue is online. Yeah, this guy couldn't even sell out the Brentwood Arena. Now, let's get this straight. When he steps up, he'll be able to sell that out in bigger arenas, the Copper Box, and eventually, if he keeps winning, the O2, and so on. But his social media profile is outweighing the numbers he can do in terms of dates at arenas, and his social media profile is more of a talking point than his actual boxing resume. His presence on social media is really what nailed the deal with the Adidas contract. A lot of these guys are comfortable before they've had to take a hard fight. When you look at one of the first, not the first, but a good template for an endorsement-friendly athlete would be Sugar Ray Leonard. Now, he had the pretty boy thing he was selling, him and Mike Trainer, his lawyer. But he could fight. He could obviously fight. During the 76 Olympics in Montreal, the television networks in America were drawn to Leonard. They were following him all around the Olympics. And mind you, this was when America was rich in amateur boxing. It wasn't no joke. And there was Russians and Cubans in this Olympic Games. And he knocked out a Cuban who was knocking out everybody. In every round, he was just stopping and beating people up, this Cuban. And Leonard destroyed him. And even then, Leonard was immensely popular. Let's not get that twisted. He got a huge purse for his debut fight as a pro. He was immensely popular. But sponsors like Coca-Cola were initially reluctant to deal with Leonard. Why? Because he had this little scandal that he had fathered a child with a woman he wasn't married to. But, it was that kind of climate at the time. Eventually, he done commercials for Coca-Cola and a whole load of other products. But he didn't get it on a plate. Like, he had to prove his worth, man. I mean, it was tough enough just getting on an American Olympic squad, let alone qualifying and let alone winning the Olympics. I mean, you think about why the big sponsors were reluctant to mess with him at that time there. Because of the unwanted baby situation. In social media, that wouldn't even matter. That wouldn't even blink an eye. You see, the press and the big corporations, they could stop you just by not writing about you or talking about you, but you can't do that these days. Back then, athletes couldn't eat without the press. You get paid for what sport you played, but outside that, if you had no access to the press, it was over. Look at Conor McGregor attacking the bus, then walk straight into a big major fight. Canelo, PD cheat, walked straight into a big, massive, the most lucrative fight of the year, walked straight back into it. Broner, in trouble all the time. He's fighting Pacquiao next. If Sonny Liston was alive today, with his stories of manhandling policemen, beating up people in the pen or whatever, come on, man. Mobster. You see, the press blackballed him for that stuff. Right now, this new formation of social media press, oh my God, they'd be eating all that up, man. It'd be humongous. Kimbo Slice, how did he get big? Fighting people on the streets. Not in no professional platform. Didn't he eventually get an MMA contract of some kind or the other? Yeah, I think he did. Because subculture is accepted culture now. The hip-hop generation, you can say. You see, Wilder's had to try and develop this persona of being the most feared heavyweight, talking about, I want a body and I'm feared and I could knock out Joe Louis. Sonny didn't breathe one word of that. And the menace was obvious. And he didn't say what. He didn't have to say, listen, he'd kill it now. Films, interviews every second, documentaries. He'd be in rap videos. He'd just like, oh man. He was genuinely feared by society and his opponents. No made up shit. He had 34 fights before he fought for the title. And because he was so feared, and because of the climate where there was no subculture to accommodate a listing, Customato and the boxing authorities froze him out of a shot for years and years and years. Yeah? But it was almost like he was a champion. You look at his record in them 34 fights in 9 years. Cleveland Williams twice, right? Nino Valdez, Mike DeJohn, fringe contender. Roy Harris, who gave the champion Floyd Patterson hell, a really hard fight. Zora Foley, contenders, fought Ali for the title, knocking them out, 3 rounds. Eddie Machin, he was fighting the competition that the champion Patterson wasn't fighting. So he wouldn't have been waiting around for no 6 years and shit like that. No. He couldn't get the shot. Machin, Foley, Cleveland Williams, all guys that Patterson weren't going to face, all black fighters that Patterson weren't going to face. Zora Foley, he never got a title shot. They say Marciano didn't want no part of Valdez. That's the story. Yeah, he took them all on when he wasn't champion. See, Deontay Wilder, he turned pro late 2008 and didn't win a title, or fight for a title, should I say. He did win the title until early 2015, so that's 6 years and change. It took him 6 years and change, 31 fights against nondescript opposition to get to that point. It's just too long. He's 33 years of age now. In modern day boxing, let's just say today, let's not start from no era. In our era here, in 2018, where Wilder brings up him being a dark-skinned black man. It's dark-skinned, it's not skinned. Now, if you're going to do the whole Ebonic slang thing, then maybe, but it's dark-skinned. I'm a black man, I'm dark-skinned. No. That hasn't affected boxers for years getting title shots. Yeah? Although I do believe Rigondeaux's face didn't fit somewhere for HBO why they didn't want to broadcast his fights. And with Bob Arum as well. After 4 years, Wilder should have been prepared to fight for a title. Sink or swim. Sink or swim. After 4 years, he should have been ready. He's not like some small dude. He's 6'7", with a big long reach. What is it you're protecting him from? If he gets beaten, he gets beaten. Ridiculous. Wilder had about 22 fights when Derek Chisora challenged Vitaly Klitschko for the WBC belt. Derek had 17 fights, and he had lost 1 to Tyson Fury. Yeah? Already fighting his domestic rivals. Wilder's fighting Marlon Hayes. Who? Jesse Ottomans and Owen Becks. This is the guys Wilder's fighting. And Derek Chisora only had 20 amateur bouts. He did win the ABAs, but he only had 20 amateur bouts. And he won some 4 Nations gold medal. Wilder had 35 amateur fights. And he had Olympic experience as well, a bronze medal. But yet, Derek fought for the title in his 17th fight, just like AJ fought for a title in his 17th fight. Before that, Derek took on world-ranked Robert Helenius in his own country in Finland and lost a controversial points decision which he should have won. Yeah? Like I said, in his 14th fight, he took on Tyson Fury for the British title and the Commonwealth title. Yeah? Wilder was fighting Damon Reed in his 17th fight. Dominique Alexander. Reed was 46 wins, 15 losses. Alexander 20-11. Anthony Joshua was fighting for titles against undefeated Charles Martin at that stage there. And before that, he was fighting undefeated British rivals like Dillian White, who was ranked number 1 in the WBC and high in other sanctioning bodies. That's what Joshua was doing. You see, Wilder likes to rubbish AJ's victory over Vladimir Klitschko. But if Wilder had beaten Klitschko in 2015 when he won the belt and unified against him, he would have not only stopped AJ from crashing the 90,000 barrier at Wembley against Vlad and becoming one of the most bankable commodities in sport. He would have stopped that, and he himself could have took matters into his own hands, perhaps, and stopped Tyson Fury. But no, he allowed Fury to get the shot against Vlad. He allowed AJ to get the shot against Charles Martin by not tying up them belts with the 50 mil that Al's got in the bag. He allowed AJ to get the shot at Vlad by not taking the first opportunity when he won the belt from Stavern to tie up the belts. He's allowed this. He allowed Parker in the game. He allowed all this on himself. He's got no one to blame. You can't blame AJ. I know he's jealous of AJ, but he should be mad at himself. He should come out in public and say, I fucked up. It'd be good for his soul. Wilder is the reason why the Klitschko fight is of such value to AJ. You're the reason why. He could have cut it all off at the source for Anthony Joshua Fury, but he didn't. He didn't. That's why he's still trying to fill out the Barclays Center and hoping to do 300,000 pay-per-views at 33 years of age in his 41st fight. 4 years. 4 years. It took 4 years from Ali winning the gold medal in Rome to winning the heavyweight championship against Liston. 4 years. Joe Louis, who Wilder said he could knock out, had 32 fights in 4 years before he took on James J. Braddock. Yeah? 4 years. 32 fights in 4 years. So a lot of times, it's not the opponents so much, although it is the opponents with Wilder, but it's not the opponents so much for the most part. It's the time it's taking you to do it in. Yeah? Because Louis was beating former champions in them 32 fights. He weren't fighting all bums like Wilder. Like Primo Carnero got knocked out. Max Baer lost to Max Schmeling. Jack Sharkey was knocked out. Paulino Oscar. And here's the thing. Joe was big in Madison Square Garden before he fought for the title. He was big already. They already loved him. Wilder fighting in Alabama and obscure locations. Joe Louis was a black man fighting in real racial discrimination, not this made up shit. Yeah? Jack Johnson won the title in 1908, and no black man had fought for the title since Jack Johnson. 26 years after Johnson won the title was when Joe Louis turned pro. So you've got the color bar against this guy, but Joe was loved in Yankee Stadium, Madison Square Garden, done big numbers there before he won the title. Anyway, when Joe Louis won the title in 1938, he effectively, well, at least by lip service, killed off the color bar in American boxing. That was still being implemented. When he became champion in 1938, they got rid of the colored heavyweight championship. And the color bar was no more, even though it was still being enforced. Eventually, it got better for black fighters. 1938. Larry Gaines, he was the last colored heavyweight champion, a Canadian fighter. In England, the colour bar remained until about 1948 or something like that, when Randolph Turpin, his brother Dick Turpin, won the British middleweight title. Floyd Patterson gets a bad rap. He won an Olympic medal in 1956 as a middleweight. He spent a lot of his pro years at 160, 164. He would have been a good super middleweight. He lost a points decision to Joey Maxim at 168. After only 13 or 14 fights, by this time he had already beaten Yvonne Durrell, who was involved in one of the greatest light heavyweight title fights against Archie Moore, right? He beat Yvonne Durrell twice. Willie Troy was a very good win in Madison Square Garden. That was at 166. He beat Tommy Jackson in an eliminator. Wasn't the greatest heavyweight Tommy Jackson, but you know, he beat him. He beat Archie Moore for the vacant title when Rocky retired, Marciano. He defended against Tommy Jackson again, which wasn't a good defense. Pete Radmaker was in the same Olympics as Patterson, 1956. He won the Olympic heavyweight title. He fought him in his second defense on Radmaker's pro debut. And Radmaker actually had him on the floor, but Patterson knocked him out. Roy Harris was a good challenge, was a 23-0, good challenge, but not the toughest. He was stopped in 12. Brian London from the United Kingdom, tough, but definitely not elite. He fought Ali, though, for the title. Ingemar Johansson, he had the 4-fight series with him, which he got the better of. Definitely a bona fide challenger, definitely great puncher. Tom McNeely, Peter McNeely's son, shouldn't have been in the ring with him. And that's where he gets the rap for a lot of his title defenses. And plus, they're marginalizing Sonny Liston for so long. Liston eventually knocked him out in 1 round. But when you look at it, there were some tough fights on the way up against Maxim. Dirrell was good, Willie Troy and them guys. And he did actually, like when he lost the title, he went to fight guys like Eddie Machin, one of the black fighters they said he ducked. He fought George Chuvalo, Muhammad Ali twice, I believe. The second fight with Ali was his last fight, I believe. Henry Cooper, he knocked out Henry Cooper in London. Yeah? He drew with Jerry Quarry. Lost on points to Jimmy Ellis, but gave him a very good fight. What it was, though, is the mob was heavy in the game. Cus D'Amato was trying to monopolize the situation for himself and freeze them out, like they were freezing fighters out. So he was cautious with Patterson's matchmaking. He didn't want him in too tough, and he didn't want him to fight no mob-affiliated fighters unless, like with the Ingemar Hansen fight, unless it was with mobsters he was, let's just say, seen fraternizing with, like Tony Earless. So he wasn't totally squeaky clean, although he did help bring down Blinky, Palermo, Frankie Carbo and them guys. He helped bring them down. And he definitely kept Patterson away from guys like Machin, Foley, Williams, Cleveland Williams, and for as long as they could, Sonny Liston. And that's the history behind Patterson's bad rap as a heavyweight. He beat Oscar Bonavina. So he fought tough opposition, man. In hindsight, people should talk about Patterson as someone who faced tough opposition. Professional boxing is, okay, let's just go to it. The business aspect of professional boxing, which is a big part of it, unlike amateur boxing, will require the padding of records. You can't avoid that. Well, you can, but you could. But this is how it's generally practiced. You pad up the record, then you fight for titles, and then you become a bankable commodity, for want of a better way of putting that. But how far do you go? Where's the limits? There has to be limits, and there has to be some checks and balances, so it doesn't look like you're just running for your life from stiff competition. Now, where that line is, I'm sure you'll try and tell me in the comments section. Peace.